Hello, feisty people. Welcome to the Women's Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Gross, and over the next few weeks, we will be counting down to the Olympic Games in Paris with a special series called Croissants and Commentary, Moments on the Road to Paris. Every week for the next 9 weeks, I will be joined by sports reporter and head of content here at Feisty Media, Kelly O'Mara. Kelly and I will unpack all things Olympics. We will talk to athletes, coaches, and other experts about everything from peak performance to nutrition, delivering you all the hype every week. Then, once the Olympic Games begin, we will be recording daily podcasts live from Paris with all the behind-the-scenes info. While we regrettably cannot share our Parisian croissants, we can and will share our feisty commentary. So, pull up a chair, grab an espresso, and let us take you to Paris with us. Kelly, we are back. Episode 4 of Croissants and Commentary. Is that where we are?
I think so. It's just been flying by. Yeah.
I know. We're on the road to Paris, obviously, and we're actually going to be in Paris, which is why in my intro, we cannot share our croissants, but we can share our commentary. Right. But I can't believe how fast it's going by. We're going to be there in no time.
In no time, which is slightly stressing me out, but that's like another topic. So
I know, right? We're like behind the scenes. I'm on a hamster wheel, really, between now and then. But Kelly, today we're talking about postpartum and pregnancy and return to sport. Tell us, why are we talking about that topic on an Olympics podcast?
Right. I mean, we wanted to cover some of the key issues. Kind of we've talked about the history, set it up, like why we're talking about the Olympics so long in advance. And then we want to talk about some key issues that female athletes are facing. So we'll be talking about mental health. We'll be talking about fueling. But I also want to talk about postpartum return to sport because it is a uniquely female athlete issue. I was obviously not 100%, but largely a female athlete issue. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing it more and more and more right now with more and more athletes returning to sport postpartum, especially like in running, in the Olympic sports. I think we're going to see a ton of athletes this year. They're actually going to have a nursery at the Olympic Village this year for the first time ever. And on the one hand, it's like, oh, wow. On the other hand, it's sort of like, well, yeah, right? Like half the population can have babies and half of them have, like, it doesn't mean, right? Like, how were we not here before?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, it's true. And it's because we like everything to do with our physiology seems to be like the reasons why we were excluded in the first place. Right. Sure. So like, it's like, oh, their uteruses will fall out if they run. Like that's where we came from. So it's no surprise that like being supported through that entire journey of especially pregnancy, postpartum, which is, the sort of in the same time of life, typically, as if you were an elite athlete, like around the same timing. So actually like supporting women fully through the journey of sport as an elite athlete includes supporting us as we're pregnant and postpartum and our return to sport, right? Which we've seen change drastically over the last 10 years.
It's actually only even been like the last 5, which is what I think is super fascinating. Because when you talk about like, why is this happening so much now, right? And we can talk about like your experience when you had a kid and came back to elite sport. That was when like Paula Radcliffe was doing it, Kara Goucher. Those were very, very early. Not that no one had done it before, but it was not widely talked about before. And now it's still like, I know a bunch of pro athletes right now who are getting pregnant and they're like, oh, it's really hard to find information. It's still really hard to find information, but now there's like examples you can follow. There's like other people you can talk to.
And we have a handful of studies too of like how to come out to. I remember, Kelly, well, first of all, it's interesting you mentioned Paula Radcliffe and Kara Goucher because I remember around the time that I had Rosie, she's 13 now, so like 14 years ago. That Kara Goucher and Paula Radcliffe were training together. They were both pregnant and they were doing track sessions. And I was like, yeah, while they were pregnant. And this was at a time where like I was told to like keep your heart rate under control, just do easy stuff. Like I had way dialed it back, and that was amazing to me. And they did like they wore heart rate monitors and like, they obviously monitored things when they were doing these track sessions, but like think about how brave that is when like the rest of the world is kind of saying take it easy while you're pregnant.
Right,
Don't take any risks. Nobody wants to risk the health of their baby. Right. And yet there they are, like on the track going, no, you know what? I think our bodies can handle this and we're going to do it. Which is kind of amazing. And then you think now, okay, now we see a lot of examples of women doing incredible things while they're pregnant.
Yeah, it's like it's like been so fast, right? You're saying like back then nobody did a track workout. Do you remember Alysia Montaño, the 800-meter runner who ran pregnant at the Olympic trials?
Yes.
Because she had earned her spot as the national champion.
And she was quite pregnant.
She was 8 months. So I was at that Olympic trials, and I know Alysia because we both went to Cal and all this, and they were so worried. Like they had a doctor like on the sidelines. She had to answer so many questions about like whether or not she was risking the health of the baby. Mm-hmm. And it's just now. I mean, that's not like you don't see it all the time now, but it's definitely far more common, right? Like you definitely would not necessarily be on the Today Show. She like was on like Good Morning America because it was crazy. It was crazy.
Yeah, it seemed crazy to people. Yeah, it really did. And even like, obviously I trusted her, the process and the, her decision making, but that was my first time seeing someone go that hard.
I mean, the other thing was like I remember being in the media room and it's mostly men and they're all like, I don't know. And I was like, guys, she's running a 2:30-800. She can run like a 1:58. Like this is significantly slower, right? Like I think that's one of the things people, they see elite athletes and they don't like, or like I hear locally, this is 10 years ago, I did like a local mile race on the road. It was like a big deal here. And I got my ass kicked by this girl who's was a pro runner. And she was 8 months pregnant at the time. And she was one of those like where like the skinny runners are very pregnant. Like they look more pregnant.
Oh yeah, because the belly is so big.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's bigger.
And so she beat me. She beat me by like 2 seconds, 8 months pregnant. And I was like, oh crap. And I remember walking on the sidewalk and these guys I knew were like, she shouldn't be doing that. That's not safe. That's not right. And now 10 years later, I know those guys, right? Still, they probably would never remember having said that. Because now they'd be like, now the conversation's changed. Now it would be like, oh, well, it's her. But that wasn't that long ago.
Wasn't that long ago.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I found out I was pregnant, I was on a training camp in Australia. And I asked, there was like some big swimming coach that we were swimming with. I don't remember who it is. It doesn't really matter.
Some big one, yeah.
But I remember like I was trying to collect information and back then, like, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, like you only had kind of like athlete blogs to go to figure out what to do. Like nobody was writing, like there was no studies. There was no one writing like a what to do during pregnancy if you're an elite athlete or like how much you could do. It just wasn't a thing. And there was this coach and I was just like gathering information. So I asked him and he said that like some of his athletes, his swimmers would actually like take it easy during the first trimester because like that's when most miscarriages take place. Statistically, yeah. And then he's like, but during the second trimester, they typically like, that's when they feel their best because they're not as big, it's not affecting their hydrodynamics, I guess, or like they're feeling in the water, but they're also like feel more confident going hard. So it's like, yeah, we typically then go back to like some interval training and like, harder work in the pool, like even some threshold work in the second trimester. And that to me was like, whoa, like you work at threshold in the second trimester, like.
There was a joke though. Kate Grace, who is a miler 800-meter runner, and she's getting ready for the trials right now. And she's been coming back. She had a combo of like she was pregnant and then she had long COVID last year. Anyway, so she was joking about doing threshold work when she was pregnant. Or like it was right when the Norwegian double threshold was really trendy. And so she just told herself that like, well, she's just doing double threshold work because her heart rate wouldn't go up. So she was like basically just telling herself that was, even though she was running way, way slower than she was like, well, it's as if I'm doing threshold. Like my heart is still getting the benefit. Which I thought was kind of funny. Yeah. Like a way to reframe it. Yeah.
I had that effect too. Like I couldn't go when I first figured out that I was pregnant, I was doing a track session. I hadn't done a test yet and I knew I was pregnant and I was doing a track session, same training camp, obviously in Australia. And it was on a grass track. And we were doing 400s and like every 400 got like 3 to 4 seconds slower. Like, can you imagine? It was like, I think it was like the first set was like 5 400s. It wasn't even a time. And like I was just like, And it was kind of like, what's wrong with Sarah? Right? And I was like, I was still kind of jet lagged.
Right,
It was hot because obviously I'd flipped winter for summer because I'd gone to Australia. Like, but I was like, still, even with the other factors, like, something's up. I think I might be pregnant.
We do have to so it's not just an accident, right? That everyone's suddenly talking about this, that it's become more normal. There have been some pioneers that really put themselves out there. We kind of mentioned a few, but we do have to give a ton of credit to Allyson Felix. She really, in 2019, writing in the New York Times, doing that big push around, she went public with the fact that Nike had cut her contract, cut all her protections that she had. And I know that was not well known before that no one had ever considered what would happen, for a pregnant athlete, that they would get their contract cut. And so she really kind of set that stage. And then I feel like then we just saw an outpouring of so many people coming out. And now maybe it combined with COVID, maybe it also combined with the fact that a lot of athletes use the COVID pandemic break to get pregnant, that now we're just seeing so many people come back. I was going to start listing them, and then I was like, the list would just get repetitive.
Well, and it's the kind of thing that I can see why there's a domino effect there, because it's the kind of thing where it's like I said about Paula Radcliffe and Kara Goucher earlier, you don't want to be the one that does the tests to see is doing hard repeats on the track bad for your baby? Who wants to be the person that experiments with that? Right? So I think that the more that we see elite athletes training, and the more that we see people exercising during pregnancy, the more that we there's this knock-on effect of okay, maybe I can do that. So I can see how that could snowball really quickly.
For sure. And we actually talked to one of the soccer players, Crystal Dunn, who was coming back post-pregnancy. And that's, not as common still in soccer. There's only been a couple. We talked to her at the U.S. Olympic Media Summit about what that's been like.
Obviously, you were just talking about the changes now being a mom. How hard was it coming back, and knowing that that's an option now?
Yeah, it was not easy coming back. It wasn't. It's still a new thing for people to know how to handle women coming back from pregnancy. I think it's different than an injury. It's kind of everyone knows how to come back from an ACL injury and how to prep people for that. But it's there's not that many women that came back from pregnancy in the NWSL who I think. So I think it was a learning curve along the way. But I surrounded myself with a lot of people that wanted to, help and support me. Physically, it wasn't easy, but I think I gave myself the best chance by being able to ask for help, to lean on others, to not feel like I'm doing this all alone, and to give myself grace when there were some days that didn't feel so great, So that's the biggest thing.
I heard you talking in the press comments about the fact that it's harder to win now, as the U.S. team was kind of the hope and the goal. Yep. So, how much do you kind of wish it was back in the days when you guys won by 7 points, and how much do you appreciate?
I think it's new challenges. It's a new era, and it's now winning feels like it's going to mean even more because there's so many resources now given to other federations, and that's where we wanted this game to grow all along. And so I think if and when we win this Olympic gold medal, I think it'll really feel like we went through a tournament with top competition that, against teams that have given us their everything. And I think it will mean, I won't say even more, but it'll mean a lot to just be able to knock out top competition in a tournament.
And last question, what advice do you give your younger teammates since you're the veteran now?
Oh man, enjoy the journey. Don't get too hung up on things that in the grand scheme of things don't matter. I think we're as athletes, we're so hard on ourselves. We think that every moment has to be perfect. And I played this game a long time to know that I've learned more from my failures than my successes. And so I feel just enjoy the journey and learn as you go.
All right, Sarah, we have an expert to talk to us a little bit in a second, but I feel like one of the things we need to say first is that so many of these stories though that we're seeing, when we see Ellie St. Pierre win a world championship, a year after giving birth, or we see Chelsea Sodaro win the Ironman World Championships 18 months postpartum, or Crystal Dunn, these are elite athletes, right? Or that the girl who beat me when she was 8 months pregnant, these are elite athletes with support systems and infrastructure, and they're coming from a different place than you are. And so I do feel like there is this danger where we're seeing so much Instagram inspo content that I don't want other pregnant mom or new moms or pregnant moms to be well, why am I not winning? Why am I not back faster in 3 months after giving birth? Because that's a recipe for disaster.
Of course. And it's different for everyone, of course, which is an annoying answer for anyone.
Yeah.
But it is true. And you do have to listen to your body. But I remember I really appreciated pro triathlete Jody Swallow. Do you remember when she came out, what a weird phrase, but like expressed on Instagram that she that she was having a hard time. She's like, this is hard. Like being a new mom is hard. I expected to be able to come back because I saw a lot of people around me doing it. And she's like, I can't, I don't want to. It's too hard. This isn't what I want to do. Right. And I was like, cool. Like, good for you. Because like, I think we need those voices too. That are like, actually, it is really, really hard. Like I remember sometimes really like my times to train, especially when my daughter was very young baby, like it would be between like breastfeeding sessions or like sometimes when you had childcare, that 2 hours where you actually had childcare or something like that. And like, actually then it didn't matter. Like it didn't matter if you slept. It didn't matter if you were hydrated. It didn't matter. Like if you were ready, you had to that was when you had to put your shoes on and go out and do the training. Right. And I think it did produce a certain toughness in me. And I've heard that from other moms too, but actually like, that's really hard. Like I understand if people don't want to.
Sure, there's also the whole thing,
the training.
Right. Whole thing, like if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. You're like, that's a lie. It might just break you down slowly and eventually kill you, right? Like that's also a possibility.
Right. Well, we know from even non-pregnant athletes that if you're not getting proper sleep, right? Like your training's going to suffer and that you're layering more stress on more stress if you keep doing that, right? So like balancing that's really hard, right? And then actually balancing it in a way that you can become fit enough to be able to actually compete again against the best in the world. Like you really have to get a lot of things right, and you really have to have a ton of support.
And I think it is, and I know I hate it. I hate it when people say it depends on the individual. Like it always depends, because I'm like, sure, but we have science, we have research. We should be able to make statements about like statistically these are the norms. The problem is right now we don't really have the research. Like obviously the elite athletes talk amongst themselves and they can kind of know like, oh, this is more common or this is more common, but we don't actually have the research. We don't know why, even for the same athlete, one pregnancy, they'll bounce back super fast and one might take them like a year and a half to like really, not have any issues. And that's just like that. And some of it's for the same reason you said that, like, nobody wants to be the first person to like test something while they're pregnant.
Right. Like you don't want to be the one whipping the pregnant woman on the treadmill to go faster. Like, no.
Right. So there's like some of it, but we haven't even done obviously environmental studies, like what like going out in the field, like watching what people are already doing. What are those called? You know what I mean?
I do.
When you, when you go out and you don't make them do anything, you just like study how they respond.
Yeah.
We're still missing, like, we just don't have the research at all.
Yeah. And there's a few studies, right? Like we do have some research, but like the way that research works is you need like a body of evidence that builds on itself. Right. And so but there are a few studies. Like I remember I actually had one of the researchers on the show a while back. And it was where they had the training logs for elite runners who had elite and like high-end amateur, high-end amateur, is that even a
elite amateurs, high-end amateurs,
high-end, like they're a pair of shoes. Elite amateurs and elite athletes, runners, like coming back from pregnancy, and they had their logs, so at least they could go, okay, make some like, okay, this is how quickly athletes tend to come back in general. And I know we're talking to someone who was involved in a study as well later. So
let's actually talk. Let's go to her right now. I talked to Dr. Shefali Christopher, who is she came into this kind of from her own experience, seeing a lot of postpartum women come to her clinic with problems, but also being a pregnant runner herself. And she's been the lead author on 2 like very, very big studies now, kind of trying to reach a consensus on what is a return to run is the most common, just because running is high impact, right? It gets at a lot of the issues of return to sport. So let's hear from her about the research. All right, we have Shefali Christopher, PT for the Paralympic tri team, expert, I feel like, in postpartum return to running, and we've known each other for 20 years, which is kind of funny.
We won't tell the audience how.
Right, all of the stories from college. So, but I do feel like you popped back up on my radar a few years ago when you started doing all this research about postpartum return to running. What made you want to study that?
Yeah, so pretty cliche story, right? Like I was a triathlete. I did Ironman Louisville right before I had my first child. And that's when I was really looking into keeping up with my fitness. That was my athletic identity.
Right.
And as I looked into what things I should do when pregnant and how to get back to triathlons postpartum, there was like nothing. And then the other thing is I was treating a lot of runners and triathletes in the clinic. And I saw a trend of women coming in, 2 years postpartum or sooner, while they tried to return to sport and were having issues. So when I decided to do a PhD and I was asked kind of what I wanted to study, I thought looking into risk factors for running related pain postpartum would be a good place to start, just because there was nothing on that. And so adding to that body of literature to help,
Right.
lots of people go through this lifespan stage and this transition, and without any guidelines, maybe we're doing things we should be doing differently.
And you guys came up, I don't want to say like conclusions, but like earlier this year, you kind of had like these final big studies on both kind of what is the current landscape and then what's sort of like the way to develop a return to run program. I'm going to be like, can you sum that up now after you've been working on it for years? But what kind of did you find when you looked at like what's happening right now and how we return to running?
Yeah. So, as things are, first of all, we don't have good research in this area. And you can understand a little bit why the pregnancy area has poor research, right? No one wants to do high level sports research on pregnant women, because if anything happens to the fetus, they don't want to, right. IRBs are not going to allow it. But there are some studies now happening where they're monitoring fetal response to higher intensities of exercise. So that's really exciting. But, that's just this wave. It's coming. We don't even, we don't have that literature yet. So in general, like research was lacking. And what we've gathered mostly is that the timeline should really be person dependent. Sure. Because how, your pregnancy journey, how your delivery journey, your any complications, depending on what you're going back to, could all be so different that it's not like a one size fit all, like everyone should do this. So that I think is a really important thing, like an individualized approach, which also brings in then slightly the timeline of return. So if you're someone, who had no complications, right up to childbirth, you were like, you hear of those people who ran the morning before and then went to the hospital, it's almost like if you think of training for something, like they're coming from, maybe less time off than someone who was put on bed rest for a complication. Okay. And then the whole delivery, part, did they labor for a really long time? Was there a lot of complications like tearing that they have to heal from? Were they other things going on, C-section, right? And so then postpartum, the healing timeline would be slightly different. And so that's another thing, people always want the golden, like, what's the timeline? Right. And so one of the things that our papers found is that a minimum of 3 weeks of rest, and then it's up to the clinician and the healthcare team to determine, based on all the factors of the person in front of you, what's a good return timeline.
And what are they looking for? Like there are different markers that they look for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Physiologic healing, wound healing. Okay. There's a little bit of bleeding after having a baby. Has that lochia, stopped? Because you don't want to increase bleeding by increasing activity. Pain. Are they having success with feeding the baby? If they're choosing breastfeeding or chest feeding, is that going successfully? All of those factors. And the one question you asked, where were we? We, because of the pendulum swing, we had caused a lot of fear of return.
Oh, really?
Through social media. Yeah. Huh. There was a lot of information on a diastasis recti, which is the increased interrecti distance between the rectus abdominal stomach muscles.
Oh, sure.
If you look at the anatomy, it's actually designed for that. The linea alba, the fascia, is designed to split and adapt to the body. But what was happening is there was a lot of like, don't do this, don't move. This is leading to back pain. And luckily research has caught up and showed like, no, actually, it may be very person dependent, and, what is normal, what's abnormal. So we and Izzy Moore's work and research actually showed that fear of movement was a factor that limited people returning to running. So there was a lot of fear. And so now I think like one of my passions really is to put information out. So you're not fearful, but you have something to go by,
Yeah, that's interesting that there was fear, because I mean, obviously, like, pendulum has swung, right? Like, now I feel like I know, like, all these athletes who are like jumping back in maybe like too quickly or really fast, and now I feel like that now we're saying like, whoa, like, slow down, don't start running, 2 weeks after, like, give it some time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's like, I like to say that this is like coming back from any other, I don't want to use the word injury, maybe a setback that's kept you maybe not at the highest level of fitness. You wouldn't go from, something that's like you've not trained for 2.5 weeks to like jumping back into your 30, 40, 50 minute, interval run.
Right.
So I think like if you've taken any time off or time back, building up is going to be important. And, we know that in too fast, too soon is a recipe for disaster, not only for bone injuries, but a lot of other things. Like the loading has to match and slowly be progressed. We don't exactly know what that progression rate is, but like watching each step. So really,
I know like you have developed, because I've like looked at it, like certain steps that you're supposed to like go at a time, right? Like, okay, when you can, do like on one leg, when you can do, this kind of load. What are the things from like an athlete perspective? Because we have so many listeners who are going to be like, well, what are the things I should look for?
Well, maybe we can even like tag the articles. There are some tables in there that can give some context. But again, they're just suggestions. And so everyone really needs to listen to their own body. Like, I want to say that first and foremost.
Sure.
But as a progression, I usually say, building up so that you can walk 30 minutes without any pain, bleeding, any symptoms of incontinence, things like that. Those are going to be important. Like, you can still sleep at night, feed your baby, fits your life. And once you can walk for 30 minutes, and again, like not going out and doing 30 minutes at a time, progressing it by, 10% has not been studied, but that's kind of the rule that we're recommending in the absence of anything else. And so slowly building that up. Okay, now you can walk 30 minutes. Now let's add some walk jog intervals and see how does that go? 3 times at that certain level. And then, okay, let's bump it up 10%. And then at least that way, you're keeping things consistent and steady, and you're hitting the time blocks, right? You're building that your body's tolerance to that load and capacity. And then the other thing is, because of the different changes, really recommending strength training during this return. So thinking about lower extremity, core, pelvic floor, all of that's going to be important as well. And so there are definitely some key strength measures to look at. There are definitely key loading and impact screens. So like you mentioned, there's a list of potential exercises to look at and see, do you look strong? Do you have any symptoms? And when I say symptoms, let's just like encompass pain or any pelvic floor incontinence, symptoms. So symptoms, and then, can you complete, whatever the reps and sets are of those exercises? And if those go well, then starting to slowly progress into a training plan. But, in the training plan, like how to design a training program, things like, changing one variable at a time. So you don't want to like increase speed and increase distance and, all of that, because then if the breakdown happens, you don't know where that went wrong.
I do think it's fascinating, Sarah, when you look at the history of what the recommendations have been over the years. And like, like Shifali said when I was talking to her, because I talked to her for much longer than this too, like there are official recommendations now, which are still like, what is it? Like 6 times 30 minutes light jogging, but they're like, you could be detraining if you were doing, right? Like that might not be appropriate. And you think back to like when you were, it was like, keep your heart rate under 120. I think like my heart rate went over 120, like walking up the stairs today. Right. That's also a personal issue, but like, there's like, right. When you think, or I was telling you about the first ever Olympic marathon trials. I was reading about this woman who did it. Like, she had qualified and then she got pregnant and she wanted to do it anyway because she had, it was the first one ever in 1984. And there was an ambulance following her the whole way. And there was like a stork watch, like waiting because they were worried she was going to give birth through the.
They called it stork watch?
Yeah, on the TV. They had like this, like it went like media friends. But I can't believe there was an ambulance literally just following her.
Well,
the thing, like,
yeah,
how it's changed. Yeah.
The thing I love about that, Kelly, is that everyone's always afraid something's going to fall out. Like, first, they figured out that our uteruses weren't going to fall out when we run. But then very quickly after that, it's like, but the baby must fall out.
The baby will fall out.
Like, I think there's something there to like, like we aren't the first generation of, or like in human history, right? There, you must have had to have women being able to like react quickly, go and spend long days doing physical things, like while they're pregnant. That literally has to be part of human history. Well, it is. Like you didn't just put pregnant women on a like they didn't just lie on the ground the whole time, like everybody went and worked in the fields and did the things that they normally
and
do.
they mostly survived. Enough of them survived. But I mean, when you think like Shefali, right? Like, Shefali, it's taken this long to come up with recommendations, and they have like a protocol now that sounds so common sense, right? Like, be able to work your way up to 30 minutes of walking before you try to run. Be able, right? There's like there's a bunch of other things that we're going to like link to in the show notes, but it's like, be able to like stand on one foot, then be able to hop, right? If you want to run, you kind of need to be able to like hop on one foot, right? Then build up and do like 1 minute of running, 2 minutes. Like these seem very, very like, oh, I could have come up with that. Be able to do a squat, right? And yet it took us like all this time and work to even start to develop like actual like phases, like a phase of training approach, Yeah.
The thing that I love, which is like also seems obvious, but it's like came out of recent research, is that we learned that it is healthier for mom and baby if the mom exercises during pregnancy, and you have better outcomes postpartum for the mom and the child if the mom exercises during pregnancy. And part of me is like, duh.
Right? There's like these things that are like, duh, but
but like actually we went through this phase, as we know, of like just being scared around exercise and pregnancy and not knowing. And I'm so glad we've come out of that and actually realized like the opposite is true. Like if you are someone who is not active during that time, you're better off to actually, increase your fitness a little bit.
Well, one of the things, again, like these are all like very rough guidelines we have now, which again like makes me nuts when it's like, what can we tell someone trying to return to pregnancy, and we can only give them like very like do like once you can walk, then do these, right? Like we can only give them very rough guidelines. But one of the guidelines that people often give is like, probably don't try to increase your pregnancy much when you're pregnant.
Your exercise,
or your fitness much, right? Like if you are, like we've talked about elite athletes, already an elite athlete, then like doing a 2-hour bike ride is fine because you've been going on 3-hour bike rides. If you've never done a 2-hour bike ride in your life, this might not be the time to start, right? Like that's sort of like a general rule of thumb, right?
Yeah, totally. I also was thinking about like how actually I thought of, as we're talking, my friend Lana, like, so she like essentially, if we look back, I bet someone could write a book about this if they haven't already. Like all of like the mom athletes who like covertly were like pregnant during the Olympics or recently postpartum, or like there's probably a whole history of this if somebody went in with that lens and told those stories. And I'm thinking of my friend Lana, who was like, she was a 5-time Paralympian, right? And during the last Paralympics, she was holding the torch for Canada.
Yeah.
And she found out she was pregnant like during her training for the Olympics. She was a downhill skier. Okay, so that's also important. Downhill skier.
Yeah.
Chances of falling very high. Yeah. And so she just like, she knew that if she said she was pregnant, she was like not going to get to go. It was her 5th Paralympics, so like, maybe, but she was tasked with holding this torch and she wanted to hold the torch, to carry the torch. And so she's just strapped up her belly. She did her whole training season, coaches, everybody there, like nobody knew she was pregnant, went through the whole thing without telling anybody. Like, that's amazing, right? Like,
It's also, I mean, people worry so much. I mean, we hear this a lot because I like come from triathlon background, and everyone's always like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't be biking when you're pregnant." And most of the time, I like what most athletes will tell you is they don't feel comfortable after a point because it's not like they can't, like they're too big, right? They can't like navigate a bike anymore.
mm-hmm.
But falling is not and then the part that always makes me kind of nuts is like, if you crash and fall to the degree that it'll hurt your baby, it's really going to fuck you up as a person. Like you will be in the hospital. That doesn't happen that often. You know what I'm saying? Like, shouldn't your main concern be that like, yeah, getting hit by a car and getting put into the ER would be bad for the baby. It would also be bad for you.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true.
And like the statistical odds of that happening are very, very low. You're more likely to get like hit by a car, like in a car accident.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it just right. But the amount that people fixate on that, they fixate on the like, well, what if you crash? And you're like, well, I've only crashed my bike like 5 times in my life, like badly. Like
You've crashed your bike 5 times. What?
Yeah, I fell a lot when I started. But anyway, you see what I mean? Like it's just sort of like it's funny how people like they always worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I understand it. Like even after some point, I remember being out riding and having some guy pull up beside me, chatty, you know, and then him being so shocked that I was pregnant, even though I was like very clearly pregnant. Like I was like in 7 months or something. Like this was not a thing I was hiding anymore. And like I could see the wheels turning. Oh, well, be careful, you know? But eventually I did, like probably around that point, around 7-month mark. Yeah. I set up my trainer.
I think a lot of people do that. Yeah. Like, they just don't feel as good out biking.
Yeah. Just like one of those things. It's like, even if it is like, like you're right. You're absolutely right. The same risk that you have riding when you're not pregnant is the risk that you have riding when you are pregnant. If you get hit by a car, it's bad. It's bad whether you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. Right. Like, and your life is valuable. That's
the part that always makes me nuts is the way we phrase it as if your life in and of itself isn't becomes more valuable when you are a, incubator. That always makes me slightly annoyed. I'm always like,
I get that.
It mattered if I get hit either. Like, even though I am not pregnant, still matters if I get hit by a car.
Yeah, it still matters. Yeah, for sure. But then like, and then I eventually got to that point where even that like 0.02% chance that I was going to get in an accident was just like, I don't even want that anymore. Sure. It's like the same reason I'm not eating sushi. Like I've never had food poisoning from sushi, but do I want the first time to be when I'm pregnant? No.
I've had food poisoning a few times and never from sushi. I've had it from cream cheese, side point. So there you go.
Well, you're not supposed to eat cream cheese when you're pregnant either, so.
Yeah, but the amount of things you're not, I think the list of things we tell people they're not supposed to do is absurd because you are still a person. You are not a human incubator.
Yes.
So I did ask Shefali, though, about some of the recommendations that they have. What can we tell pregnant women to do in terms of training? And if there's anything that gives you like better outcomes. But I was also thinking whenever I talk to elite athletes kind of training through pregnancy, they also, a lot of them, and we don't have the research, but they've scoured like every comment board online. They've talked to like and they've come up with these kind of like plans of what they're going to do throughout pregnancy that they think will help them return faster. Is that like, are there things you can do or are they like?
Yeah, no, I mean, the researchers showing that if you did some pelvic floor work during pregnancy, that it could help postpartum. It's a muscle, like the pelvic floor is a muscle at the end of the day. And so keeping it strong, like the rest of the body, could be beneficial.
Sure.
Staying fit is staying fit.
Sure.
And that's the other thing, if you look at pregnancy guidelines, they're very conservative, 30 minutes a day at moderate intensity. You should be able to talk when you're exercising, so if you followed those, which that's the recommendation, everyone will follow those, then you might actually be detraining the athlete, right? So then now they're coming back. So I think that, work is being done in this area, but we've got tons more to do because people, like, we know that exercise is really beneficial for the baby and the mom. We just don't know how much or how intense and what effect that has. And that work is being done right now. So the summary is, keep up doing what you've been doing and just go, stay monitored, see how you feel. And it doesn't hurt to be a little bit more conservative.
Sure.
If you're feeling like you should. And if you're not sure, then just stay conservative, because would hate for something to happen while we're trying to figure out the effects of
Sure. It does feel like the doctors, like the official researchers and stuff, you guys can't say like go nuts because you don't want anything bad to happen. But like the athletes are all talking to each other and they're like, well, I did this and it was fine. Like,
yeah, I don't want to, I get a lot of hate mail anyway from like, you said they could go back at this timeline and I've seen this. And so I don't want any more, but again, like athletes know their body. I mean, Kelly, like, when to push it, when you've pushed it too much, when you should take a step back. I mean, I ran the DC half marathon at 24 weeks pregnant. It was the Nike women's half marathon.
Oh yeah.
And like, they don't have that anymore in DC, but like you got the Tiffany's necklace.
Yes, we had that. Yes.
And like, I had signed up before I knew I was pregnant. So I was going to do the race, and it was my second kid. So I think I felt a little bit more confident about everything. And right the weekend before, when I was doing my last run, I started having some contractions, like just cramping, all over. And I was like, maybe I'm dehydrated. Maybe this is not a good sign, And I was like, well, we'll do a rest week and we'll do the half at like snail's pace and see what happens, right? The goal is to just be out there and see. I was doing it with my sister-in-laws, and so it was going to be fun. And at mile 6, I had to stop and get on the sag wagon because the contractions were getting, and I think like baby's weight increased. My body was maybe not strong enough to handle the changes. And so it was, it was one of those, I was like, this is not one to push. I'm going to get on that sag wagon and call it a day. And so I think like really listening to your body is going to be important. Like that maybe too much. Maybe I should stop the weekend before. I had a very supportive healthcare team too that said, yeah, as long as you can keep running. So
when you say, just because I know it comes up a lot, when you say like pelvic floor PT, like working on your pelvic, like what do we mean by work on your pelvic floor postpartum PT? Like what is that?
Yeah, so the pelvic floor is a group of muscles that are at the bottom of your pelvis, and they support all your organs, and they actually connect to your bones in the pelvis. And so when you are pregnant, the weight of the baby is on those pelvic floor muscles, so they're starting to work even then. And then depending on delivery type, you may have a vaginal delivery, and so there may be further damage or tearing or different things in the area. So when we say work on your pelvic floor, and actually non-pregnant, like female athletes have a lot of incidents of pelvic floor symptoms. So when we say work on your pelvic floor, this is actually an important conversation, because a lot of people think of doing like contractions and Kegels, but like any muscle, it could be too weak, which is when you would do the contractions, or it could be too tight. And so telling someone to just do their Kegels may be the absolutely wrong advice, and they may need to actually do some relaxation.
Okay.
So number one, if you are having any symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction, so that could be incontinence, even a few drops of leakage of urine, feces, or even gas, like uncontrolled, it might be good to talk to a pelvic health provider. And there's some amazing ones out there. Other things, pressure in that area, those could be signs of pelvic organ prolapse, pain during sex. That shouldn't be happening. And those are all reasons to consult with a pelvic health provider. And then what they do is it's not like your OB appointment or your GYN appointment where you're like scooting to the edge of the table and it's a digital finger palpation, and they'll like test the strength, they'll test the endurance, they'll test how fast, how slow, all of the things that muscles do, and come up with some ideas of like, are you too tight? Are you too weak? These are some things you should do. They may change, how many sets and reps, how long you hold, how long you relax. So those are some amazing things that a pelvic health provider can do. And there are lots of stuff externally as well, like, your adductors may be contributing to the tightness, so let's add that, some soft tissue work into the to the mix, or adductors are really weak. Now your pelvic floor is doing the job for them. Let's continue to strengthen. So when in doubt, it's not a bad idea to find your friendly neighborhood pelvic floor physical therapist and consult with them. And a few will do, consult calls to see if this is the right fit and match. And there's also ways online to find a pelvic health provider through the American Physical Therapy Association.
So PT, physical therapy for your pelvic floor, have you, like, I had actually never really seen this before a few years ago. And now I feel like I see shops, clinics around. Have you ever done pelvic floor PT?
I was so lucky, Kelly. Like, I know I was lucky to not, like, I didn't have issues. Like, and I still don't postpartum. But when I was coming back, like, it wasn't talked about. Nobody said anything to me about it. Like, I think what ends up happening is, like, if people have really bad issues with pelvic floor and things that they need to deal with, they actually, like, have to go and seek help. Right. And then other people suffered in silence. Right. I think now, and the reason why we see so much of it, especially as women, and we make a lot of women's health content around here, there's the conversation, just like the conversation around pregnancy and postpartum, while training and exercising has shot up. Like, there's so many more people talking about it. It's the same thing with pelvic floor. Like, it affects so many women, and it's good that we're suddenly like we're starting to have those conversations and not be so embarrassed about, accidentally peeing ourselves or whatever.
Yeah. I was thinking about, like, I've talked to a number of, like, pro athletes and elite athletes as they were getting pregnant over the last few years. And a few years ago, one of them was like, TMI, Kelly. And she started telling me, like, all this, like, pelvic floor stuff she was doing kind of during pregnancy, hoping, because, like, there was preliminary research that would help with, like, coming back to, one, with delivery and with recovery, but two, like, coming back faster. But she was like, don't, like, TMI, right? Like, oh, like, people don't want to hear about this. And I find it, like, fascinating. So.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I'd have to dig back the episode of the Women's Performance Podcast where it was, like, the PT who talks about everything. And, like, within a minute of our interview, like, she's talking about, like, pissing and crapping yourself.
Right.
Just, like, openly. And I was like, actually, it was a great way to start the podcast because it, like, pulled in anyone who has those types of problems. Also, interestingly, when we had our first Women's Performance Summit during COVID, like our first feisty one, that's when I really saw it. Like, how many, we had over 1,000 women at the summit, and we had a session that was a breakout session. So there are 3 sessions happening at the same time.
Right.
And one was about pelvic floor, and, like, the number of people that went, like, we would have put that topic on the main stage if I had known even at that time, 4 years ago, how popular and how popular a topic would be and how common it is to have problems.
Interesting. I mean, I know it's something like, it's, like, statistically something like 50% of women postpartum do have, like, some level of incontinence problems, especially running, right? Because of all the issues we're talking about. Yeah.
And it can come back during perimenopause and menopause too.
Interesting.
Like, so when your hormones start changing again. So it's a lifetime challenge.
Well, good to know. You're like, great. There is, like, I mean, I also have gotten, like, okay, so it's fascinating to me because Shefali mentioned early on about how we've had this kind of, like, pendulum shift where it used to be people were super, super scared to do anything. And now I feel like sometimes people are, like, probably jumping back too fast. And so I'm going somewhere with this because one of the things that I've heard some really horror stories is people, especially elite athletes, jumping back into running and training too quickly because they want to get back to, like, they have some deadline, right? Like, they want to make some championship, they want to make some race, and they've had, like, pelvic floor failure. And that shit terrifies me because, like, it's basically like they fucked it up so much that they, like, don't have control anymore. Like, not just like, oh, sometimes I pee myself when I'm running really hard. It's like, and then they basically also, like, fully can't run at all anymore, right? Like, because they have so much pain.
What's the rehab to that?
Pelvic floor prolapse. Well, that's like when you end up in, like, a PT, right? That's when you end up, like, at PT, maybe 2 years after you gave birth, because you're like, why am I still having problems? And so, yeah, there are these, I don't want to say, like, horror stories, but there are these, like, extreme things that can happen, right? Which just, those always stress me out. They're rarer but you hear about them. And I think like there are the occasional runners, especially that their stories kind of
Yes.
make it out. Yeah.
So it's interesting because like as we talked about earlier, like when I was pregnant, I didn't have any official medical advice about coming back. So it was all just like elite athletes talking to each other. But I had actually 2 friends who were elite runners who had pelvic fractures coming back. Right.
Yeah,
so they end up, because when you're breastfeeding, you have more calorie, you're using more calories, and then you're like running, and it's really hard to keep up with your caloric needs. And so you're more likely to sustain a fracture. Right. And it's just like interesting to me that then they end up with pelvic fractures.
That's a tense fracture.
And it's a lot harder to recover from, and it really sets you back, right? Like, so I remember thinking, you know what, like it is way worth it to do like a steady comeback, and be sure that I'm not going to get into that kind of situation.
We also talked to Shefali a little bit about the research around some of those issues, why, like, because you can kind of put them in the category of like there are these acute injuries, right? Like you come out of labor and you had like an extreme tear, or like, you know, you have like very specific but then there's also, like you're saying, kind of what she called like socio-cultural, right? Like these biosocial factors. And so we talked a bunch about that too. And I think it's really interesting.
I think one other really big part is to consider other biopsychosocial factors. So we're learning a lot about sleep in all populations, but this population, like sometimes babies don't sleep.
Sure.
So if you're, you know, a new mom, and I always get a laugh when I'm presenting this data in a conference, because I'm like, we found in one of our studies that less than 6.8 hours of sleep increased the odds of running related pain. But
sure.
Who gets 6.84 hours of sleep, right? So what the way we use it clinically is, you know, if tomorrow is a really hard benchmark workout, or, you know, you're doing repeats for time or something like that, then maybe tweaking the week to move it so that it's maybe an easier day. Because if you've gotten 2 hours of sleep and the baby was up constantly, we don't want to put you in a situation where your body's stressed and then stress it some more.
Right.
And, or, you know, lots of fatigue. So, you know, postpartum fatigue is something that happens in everybody. So, you know, if you're someone whose fatigue levels are pretty high, then the return might be a little bit more gradual than someone who has a lot of support and, you know, is not feeling as fatigued. So there are so many other biopsychosocial factors in this population that we need to consider. And hopefully athletes have some of those things in place, right? You know, because their job is to perform.
When you're talking about I feel like I've talked to a lot of athletes, and I kind of think of the postpartum issues as like there are these like acute injuries, right? Like you hear about like pelvic floor failure or like diastasis, what I can never say that word, but with the abs. But then there's also the like if you're breastfeeding and you're not sleeping, and these things also add up, and then they start to have bone injuries or energy deficiency issues is usually the issue, right? And I feel like there's both those. What are the most common? Am I getting that right? What are the most common issues that you see?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And actually, the energy deficiency piece is really key here in this population, because think about it, right? Like your BMI is higher after having a baby because you've naturally gotten put on some weight, right? And so postpartum women are trying to drop that baby weight. And so sometimes it comes in it comes with the nutrition piece. And if they are choosing to breastfeed, chest feed the baby, then that's an extra amount of calories. So now, you know, if you need X amount of calories and you're already like not eating enough and you're breastfeeding, you're already in that energy deficiency state, which is a really big issue in this population.
For sure.
You add to that may be, and we're looking into it a little bit more, the drop in bone density just from pregnancy and lactation. And so if there's that already drop in bone density, and now someone's not, you know, has an energy deficiency, it may be a recipe for disaster. And then thirdly, you know, if like I was concerned about someone having some low energy availability, one of the big things is to ask about menstruation and like when the last period was, and look at, you know, amenorrhea. But if they choose to lactate, the physiology works out that you don't have a period during the time. And so now we have to go into like maybe labs and other things to figure out if the body's functioning as it should. So it's a very complicated issue in the postpartum athlete itself. And yeah, keeping that in mind is going to be hugely important for just their health, musculoskeletal health.
So I always think of this. So Chelsea Sodaro won the Ironman World Championships 18 months postpartum, right? So we were both there, right? And it was like crying, and
it was a moment for sure.
And so I did this big magazine story a couple months, like not even that long after, about all these moms coming back. There was a wave of triathlon moms, and I talked to Chelsea at the time, and I've known her for a little while. And so I was like, Chelsea, I was like, why is it so hard? And we both sat there for a second, and we're like, that's a good question, because it really starts to go to like all these things Shefali was just talking about, where there's the physical part, and everyone thinks about that physical part, but then there's the sleep and the stress and the childcare and the do you have support and and that all adds up, right? Like, and you think like I can come back from the physical part, like, oh, I'll be fine on 6 hours of sleep and breastfeeding, but like you won't. Like eventually you won't.
Yeah, or even less than 6 hours of sleep, right? I think the other thing that in the psychosocial realm is like the responsibility. Right? That we don't necessarily like, it's not tangible, right? Like not only do you have less time and you're getting less sleep, but you have less bandwidth because you're responsible for like a tiny, helpless human. Right. And often if you're breastfeeding, you're the only one who can feed the baby in the early days, right? Depending on like now, that's another thing we haven't talked about. Very recently, the rules, quote unquote, or the protocols around bottle feeding have changed. Like even
they very much have, yeah.
Even when I had Rosie, there was this huge fear around nipple confusion, right? Which was like, don't give your baby a bottle because they might get nipple confusion, and then they won't breastfeed, and then you're going to affect your baby's health and their immune system and that, right?
Honestly, that feels like another one of those things where we were like telling women like, you're going to do this wrong.
Yeah,
It does.
Yeah. It's funny because I had like an experience where my doctor told me, like when we were talking about the postpartum process, like I think while I was at the end of my pregnancy, and I told her something about, like I was asking about like, when can I go back to the pool? Like I just wanted her. And she looked at me and she said, Sarah, you will stay home and you will breastfeed this baby. Like she was like
serious.
Weirdly serious with me. And I was like, do you think that because I'm going swimming for half an hour, I'm not going to take care of my baby? Like, what is what is going on here? Right? Like,
yeah, there's this other, I mean, that's sort of the whole, like we were talking about biosocial factors specifically around you and your support network, but there's the bigger, which like you and I talk about all the time, social factors, right? That are like the larger expectations and the shit that just gets projected.
Or imagine like my daughter's dad saying, like being at a doctor's appointment and saying like, you're gonna go swimming after your baby is born? No, you will stay home and you will take care of your baby. Like what? It's ridiculous, right?
But I do think you're right. And I'm not gonna like, we haven't talked about breastfeeding research, and I'm not an expert or anything. And I know like people have strong feelings about this. So like, you're going to do what you're going to do. But I will tell you, like my sister just had a kid, and she was at Boston Children's, which is like one of the best maternity hospitals in the country. And because of like different complications, they had to give the baby a bottle like right away. Right. And they asked her like, do you want breast milk? Because they have breast milk stored there. Or do you want formula? Like it's your choice. And she was like, well, which one's better? And the doctors are like, formula. like that's what they told her, because it's like higher nutrient.
Right.
There's a modern hospital level for a baby that is right. Like when you're, you know what I mean? Like when you want to get the baby to grow more and stuff. Right then. And like there are other issues, sure, but I just found that fascinating that they told her, and it does take a lot. For sure, if you're mixing then bottles and breastfeeding, it does take a lot of the sleep stress off. It takes a lot of the extra energy stress off. It really changes things. Yeah.
Well, like my bestie just had, like she has 2 under 2 right now. And so she like, and she has a lot more freedom because she can do her feeds. Like she's been breastfeeding both of them, and like she can breastfeed, or she breastfed both of them. Not she still is, to be clear. But like she could choose to like pump and have some in the fridge, and then she breastfeeds, and then she has all this flexibility. Whereas like I spent. You didn't. And it was fine. Like I love that period of time. I really am not complaining about breastfeeding. I love breastfeeding, but like, I didn't have, like, I actually would have bought myself a time off. You know what I mean? Like I definitely would have used that, or like spent more time. Then I could leave the house for 3 hours, for example, once in a while, in those first few weeks, which I didn't get to do. So it's a lot of these different issues that compound and are part of what like make it so hard to come back as a female athlete. But it's also, and we kind of just hinted at this, like the systemic ones. And that's, I think, where we are also seeing a huge amounts of change right now. Like, it's not just like, we needed somebody to go first and set an example. It's also, and this is like, I think like a personal pet peeve. I always hate when people put things on the individual that are actually like corporate and systemic. It was also that we needed like maternity policies to change. Right. We needed contracts to change. We need like childcare at races. We need like, the US has a childcare problem, right? And like, we're talking a lot about US athletes here. And like, there is no guaranteed parental leave in the US, even like in the States where it is like somewhat like you can do essentially like sick leave and get like half pay for, it's still you're like back at work 6 weeks, 4 weeks. It depends on what state you live in. That's crazy, right? Like, and so these are systemic policy issues that aren't just like, Sarah, just believe that you can, right? There's no like leaning in, just believing your way out of systemic injustice. That's the thing that bothers me. Absolutely. Or that's part of what's changing. Yeah. For sure. Those things are changing. And don't we have childcare in the Olympic Village for the first time in Paris? Is that right? Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's on one hand, I'm like, yes, that's amazing. On the other hand, I'm like, what? The first time you've had childcare in the Olympic Village is 2024? Like, I feel both. As with so many things, I feel I'm of two minds about it always. Like, on one hand, I'm like, yay, amazing progress. On the other hand, I'm like, how did we end up with so little progress?
How did we get there? Yeah. It is, so we were at the Ironman World Championships back in October, and it was the first all women's, like women's only Ironman World Championship, right? And I think, and you and I have spent like all this time working on this, like we certainly like were very aware of the larger implications, but I don't think I had really thought about some of the on the ground specifics, which was that, now guys have kids too, kids come, but there was a childcare issue that like didn't need, like that was at another level, right? And I didn't think about the fact that like every single one of those like 2,000 women had then like their husband had to take care of the kid. The husband can take care of the kid, but you saw it at this like large scale level that you don't usually see at sporting events. And it was like eye-opening, right? That like, one, this is possible. Yeah. You could do it all the time, guys. But like, it was also like really great to see that like, oh, actually you can do this on like like we can have 2,000 women race and everyone can like chip in and handle it, you know?
It was like, there were so many things that were so cool about the women's only Ironman World Championship. But actually, like, when you think about that, like you just said, Kelly, like women on the main stage who are the main sporting event, you know, and support systems and men, like taking care of the kids by the side, cheering on, like that was incredible to see. Right. Yeah. There were so many like things that, you know, like give you shivers or excitement from that race, but that was definitely one of them.
So when we think about like where we're going from here with this postpartum issue, because again, like I think there's this tendency, and maybe it's less and less now, but there's a tendency to think of the postpartum issue as like an issue, right? It's like a niche topic in sports, but it's like, obviously it's not a niche topic in sports. It's a large topic for half the like for all women who are female. I mean, even if you don't want to have kids, right? Like it's still like often a thing that like you have to deal with at that level. And so as we kind of progress in this, I do think what I want to see from here is both like more research where we have actual recommendations that like make sense, not just are very generic, right? Like more research now on the recommendations that we have and how they play out, like what happens. I also want to see like more systemic, right? Like I want to see more childcare. I want to see more like contracts, like sports brands contracts that like with maternity clauses, with maternity pay. So there's all these kinds of things. And there's a lot of organizations working on this, but these are the things I want to see from here for sure.
For sure. Mine would be like sports specific research and recommendations too. Like, you know, we've talked a lot about running. It is an interesting case study, but like also you have all kinds of other like team sports that include impact, for example, or like other factors that might affect a pregnancy or you postpartum that have completely different, where a mother would have completely different needs.
Oh yeah, like soccer and basketball, you have a lot more like movement, like what's the word, lateral, that like is a different kind of like return on those joints and those tendons. Yeah,
or even would affect the actual pregnancy differently too.
So yeah, that's where I hope we go from here. We're not quite there yet. Maybe we will move as quickly in the next 5 years as we have in the last 5 years, after centuries of
seriously, with all the investment going into women's sports right now, like that investment's like going to pay dividends over years, right? Like there has to be continued progress, at least in some kind of like 5 years. I think at least we've got at least 5 years of continued progress, Kelly.
You think so?
At pace. Yeah. Okay, where are you and I going from here though? What happens next?
We are going to talk about mental health on our upcoming episode, and then we're going to talk about fueling. Obviously, both again topics that affect kind of all athletes, but are very specific to female athletes, kind of, and are going to be big at this Olympics, I think. And then we'll talk about the Paralympics too, and then we'll kind of wrap up with our like getting ready for Paris, Sarah. It'll almost be here.
It will almost be. It's happening so fast. Whew.